So Second Temple Judaism was focused around several different themes that set the stage that helped Christianity succeed. Another aspect of Second Temple Judaism was the sects of Judaism, the different groups that existed. Ones that if you've studied the life of Christ, you have heard. Some, though, that you probably have not heard from those classes, but probably heard of elsewhere. Right? So you have the Pharisees, the Sadducees, another group known as the Essenes, and of course the Zealots. The Zealots were not so much concerned about religion as they were about politics, specifically wanting to get the Romans out of Judea. And so their focus was on getting rid of the Romans. The Pharisees were the most popular group, and a lot of it was driven by common people that they weren't governmental officials. And a lot of the focus of the Pharisees was on purity, particularly when it came to the law. And of course, with that came the notions of both the Torah and tradition, and the importance of tradition. Of course, we see Jesus interacting with the Pharisees over those issues because tradition has become so important to a lot of Pharisees that they often did things that ran counter to the law. But although the Pharisees quite rightly get a bad name in Scripture, we also have to think about how that Pharisaical approach to Judaism, focused on the law, right, and the importance of the law and relating to God in a pure state, often allowed people to be open to the message of Jesus. I think part of the reason Paul is such a good convert for God to bring in has to do with his Pharisaical upbringing. Yes, there's the legalism that we should avoid, but there's some aspects of him being a Pharisee that God is able to turn to being useful for spreading the message of Jesus. So the Pharisees were mostly the lay people. Most of them weren't priests. Most of them weren't in power. Instead, those in power were the Sadducees, who had often embraced Hellenization, which led to a lot of conflict because the Pharisees said, right, the law teaches we shouldn't be intermingling these cultures. They were collaborative with Rome. And we don't know much else about them, largely because those records aren't left. Most of what's said about the Sadducees comes from people that were not Sadducees. I mean, like the New Testament. Other Pharisaical writings talk about the Sadducees, but there really aren't any Sadduceical, I don't know if that's a word, but if it's not, it should be, writings. But the main thing we know about the Sadducees, of course, is they denied the afterlife, they denied spiritual beings like angels, they only accepted parts of the Bible, the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, as authoritative, just those books of Moses. The Essenes were the fourth group here, a smaller group, very intense, often connected with a group of documents known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were very strict about membership. There was a waiting period and probation that you had to go through to become a member. Right? So if you were kind of like given a trial membership, so to speak. They practiced very strict discipline on themselves and on members, and even engaged in water purification rituals, like baptism. Often, the Essenes saw the larger Jewish society as whole as corrupt, and so they went out into the wilderness, into the deserts, to practice, and live out there. And so some people have suggested that perhaps John the Baptist had been influenced by the Essenes, right? Out in the wilderness, preaching baptism, very strict about discipline. Might be a possibility. In kind of boiling down Second Temple Judaism, and Gonzalez emphasizing these two fundamental tenets, two beliefs that would be important across the board for Jews, that I think are very important for thinking about the origins of Christianity. First is ethical monotheism. Now, what's ethical monotheism?
I guess firm belief that there is one God.
Okay, so the monotheistic part, right? There's one God, but why call it ethical monotheism? Why not just say monotheism?
Maybe there's people who believed in one God, but it wasn't the God of heaven and earth. You know, there's an idol or something. I don't know. Maybe polytheistic sort of thing. Not long.
Okay.
Ethical monotheism, it's just like looking at ethics. I mean, that maybe the God that you have just determines what you do in life instead of actually being ethical. You know, kind of keep it as a law instead of actually believing in whatever it is.
Yeah, remember, you know, the God of Judaism and the God of Christianity, who are the same one, was a God that expected his people to act ethically. That wasn't really the concern of the Greeks and Roman gods. Their concern was, are you doing the right sacrifices? And so ethical monotheism was not just an affirmation that there was one God, but that one God had expectations ethically about for his people. A second tenet of Judaism that Gonzalez knows as fundamental is that of eschatological hope. Eschatological or eschatology dealing with the end times or things that will happen at the end. Essentially here we're talking about the Messiah. This coming Davidic king. Now in ancient Judaism, a lot broader than what we think of when we think of Messiah from a Christian standpoint. But these were two things that tied Jews together at the time. Despite the different types of groups, these were the things that united them. When it comes to where they disagreed, Gonzalez points to three areas that were the main disagreements of Jews and these different groups of Jews. First was the contents of Scripture. As we talked about, Sadducees only accepted the books of Moses, whereas the Pharisees accepted the prophets and Psalms and other components. Which is why, think about the end of Jesus' life. A lot of groups and people are coming to question him. And the Sadducees have this question about the resurrection that they've concocted, about this woman that ends up married to 7 different brothers at 7 different times. Right? Whose wife is she going to be in the resurrection when they don't believe in the resurrection? Right? And Jesus quotes to them from Exodus. Now when you look at the Bible, the Old Testament, the Bible that existed in his day, if you want to talk about resurrection, it's more clear to talk about something maybe from the Psalms or Daniel, much more clear, Ezekiel. But he doesn't quote from there, he quotes from Exodus. Why? The Sadducees would have accepted Exodus as an authoritative book, as Scripture. They don't accept Daniel and Ezekiel as Scripture. And so Jesus very wisely and astutely points to a passage in their own Scriptures and says, God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And so Jews disagreed over Scripture. They disagreed over how you relate to the culture around you, right? To the pagans. Right? Hellenization. You adopt Greek modes of dress. So you have this relationship to the pagans. But then there's also this relationship to apostates. Apostates mean those that have fallen away. Right? So the Jews that have adopted Greek culture or who have left worship of the one true God, how do you treat them? How do you relate to them? And so the Essenes, of course, said, you move out in the desert. Get away from them. Where others tried to say, okay, you live among them, but you ignore them. And then finally, they differed over the nature of God, of what God was doing for Israel, and when it would take place. And so, Second Temple Judaism, which is where Christianity arises from, has some unity, has some division, but there are some things that are taking place that help early Christianity be successful. What about in the Greco-Roman world? We've already talked a little bit about Greek and Roman deities. They were non-exclusive, meaning you could worship whatever deity you wanted, but most people tended to align themselves with a particular deity. And often that could change throughout your lifetime based on situations in your life. So if you were having an illness, you might start focusing on Asclepius, the god of healing. Additionally, in this religious system, there was a lot of blending, right? So the Greek god Zeus and the Roman god Jupiter are the same god, as the proclamation. And so, as the Roman Empire spread, it would blend these deities together. Oh, your gods are our gods, just with different names. There were, however, some places in Roman thought that it started moving towards monotheism. It wasn't consistent. It wasn't, it wasn't something continual. But some people were leaning that way already. But people believed in astrology. They believed in magic. Often, a lot of religion was related to social activities. And so before their games, there would be sacrifices. Or you would have festivals in the temple of the deity. Worship took place in temples. Worship took place at home. But as the Roman Empire spread, worship also was turned to the emperor. And so you have the rise of emperor worship, or the ruler cult, where rulers, emperors, would be deified, sometimes within their own lifetimes. So while they're still living, they're proclaiming their divinity. Because of all the ways that Greek and Roman religion pervaded society, it was considered to be a civic duty to be involved in religious rituals. It was part of what it meant to be a part of Rome, to worship the gods. Which, of course, means for Jews and then later Christians, they're looked upon by a lot of people as not being good citizens because you won't worship the gods. On the other hand, there was philosophy, the way of life, how to act ethically. So people went to philosophers to understand the nature of reality. They went to philosophers to ask them moral advice. What's the right thing to do here? And of course, there were a variety of schools that developed in Greek culture that were later adopted by a lot of Romans in answer to those questions. Two of the most important were Platonism and Stoicism. Platonism, there's a variety of things we could say about Plato and then his followers. But a couple of things come out of Platonism that were very helpful for early Christianity. First was the notion that there was something within human beings that continued after death that was indestructible, a soul that was immortal. Now that would later become problematic because Christians would spend more time talking about the immortality of the soul instead of the biblical terminology, which is about the resurrection of the body. And so when you think about life after death, the emphasis in the Bible is on the resurrection of the body, not the immortality of the soul. Plato and his later followers were also very critical of the ancient gods. And Plato, 300 plus years before Jesus, so there's this consistent challenge of the ancient gods of Greece and Rome, and so that was a place of affinity. Plato believed in one supreme being, so that monotheistic trend. And so there were some things within Platonism where Christians could make some connections with the culture around them. But sometimes, as we'll see, Platonism ended up influencing Christianity instead of the other way around. When it comes to Stoicism, there were a couple of places where Christianity had some connections. First, the Stoics had a very high morality. They had high expectations of moral behavior. They too criticized the old gods, the gods of Rome and Greece. But for the Stoics, they didn't really believe in a personal God. And so that's an area where there would be a lot of difference. The Stoics tended to focus on reason rather than emotion. And so reasoned arguments were the way to go. And also important for the Stoics was love and the power of love in human experience.